Thank you so much for having me. I do think we have an amazing story here in Detroit, not only from Detroit Future City, for the Detroit Future City perspective, but from all of the initiatives that are happening right now. I'm a third generation Detroiter. My grandmother lived on Mendota, and that led up to the 96 freeway, and every summer, for the most part, we lived here in the Bay Area, but we would spend every single summer of my entire life in Detroit. And I was born in Hutzel Hospital in Detroit. So Detroit is in my blood. I've been working there as an organizer and a professional for 25 years. And I've been gone now working for National LISC for the last 10 years, 16 years, and out of Detroit for 10. Working out of Detroit for 10. And coming back after having been so deeply enmeshed in Detroit 10 years ago, and 10 years ago was pretty serious, right? There was a lot that was happening in 2006 that set the city into a turmoil when I left. And then returning to a completely different place, working on the ground with many of the same faces, but a lot of different faces as well. And I think what struck me most of all was, in fact, Detroit Future City. And so coming back and taking this job was also learning about what ended up happening to that amazing planning process. And as it was said earlier, Mayor Bean did in fact say, we're going to shrink the city. And the city said, the hell you're not. And what came of that, right? The process of that, the future of that, and how to engage an entire city of 700,000 people, I think struck me most of all. And what we found, even from the implementation point of how do we move forward, once we begin a planning process that begins with, let's look at the city as a whole. This is where we stand right now. We have 20 square miles, just of vacant property, 20,000 square miles, just of vacant property. And it's not going to change. It's not going to get any better if we let it sit the way it is. But furthermore, the people with the answers can't always be the people with the PhDs, the people with all of the experience. It has to also be the people who live there as well, the people who own businesses there, the institutions, the people who spend their time there every day. And so Detroit Future City, the process that Wendy spoke of, then became this much more envisioned, this future process of this is what our city can be in the future. And that is how we ended up with 100,000 people, 100,000 Detroiters. I have worked in a lot of cities. I've never seen anything like this. 100,000 Detroiters ended up being a part of that planning process. And let me tell you something. Coming back to Detroit after 10 years and taking on this position, the one thing people have said to me, when I took the position, people said, hey, there's this big book, we wrote the Detroit Future City Plan, it's dated, don't worry about it, just skim through it. Skim through it. People were coming to me in the grocery store quoting it. They knew the maps. On a page 142, it says, my neighborhood is going to look like this. What are you going to do about it? No. I had to understand what everyone was talking about because this book was important enough that 100,000 people had participated and had a lot of expectations about what was going to be done in their city. The other thing that I think was really important that came out of the Detroit Future City planning process, that is the lesson learned, is that changing a city in its entirety is more than just thinking about land and economic development and building and assets in a siloed kind of way, but it has to be interdependent. How do all of these things affect change altogether, as they say in Detroit? So economic growth, land use, city systems, neighborhoods, land and building and assets affects every Detroiter. I don't care where you live in Detroit, and there's a lot of Detroiters here, right? Raise your hand if you're actually living in Detroit. If you live in Detroit, You live with vacancy and abandonment. I don't care where you are. I don't care if you're in a brand new building downtown. I don't care if you're in a hot new neighborhood. I don't care if you're in an old established neighborhood. Vacancy and abandonment is a part of where you are and what you drive past, right? And so all of the planning process has to be integrated. And for neighborhoods that are higher income and the lowest income neighborhoods, everyone had that in common, improving the city and how they move forward with that. And so part of what we also had to do was think about Detroit and get everybody to think past the next 2 to 3 years, which was, in 2012, a really, really hard conversation to have when they couldn't get the ambulance to come on time, to think about what their neighborhood was going to look like in 50 years. However, why this was so important, and why this is so important for us even today, right now, as we can, in 2016, as we're moving this plan forward, is that what these neighbors look like in terms of employment districts and connecting people to opportunity and health and land use is going to affect their own prosperity, both now and in the future. And so what's really most important about this is that the people who are living, you'll see to the far right, that area of the corner that's green, and even in the far left, the areas in the neighborhoods that are the greenest, those are the areas where there's the highest levels of vacancy, right? And so people live over there. Those aren't just parks. These are neighborhoods where people live. And in some of those places, not just there, but throughout, where there's the most intense green, whether it's the lighter green or the darker green, there might be only 2 houses on that block. So what we had to do was help those families starting there and then really thinking about in the areas where it's transforming, where there's the areas of largest vacant land, to the growing areas where there was some level of growth and a moderate level of density, to the areas of high level of economic opportunity. We had to begin thinking about what those neighborhoods would look like in the future. And it could be in the areas where there's only 2 houses on a block that we think about it in terms of large land use, or a low-dense community where there's all kinds of economical and environmentally sustainable areas where these families would now have reduced energy costs, and the city would then reduce their own infrastructure. And in the areas of moderate growth and economic growth, we think about how to access their opportunity for jobs and businesses in places where we can then begin to grow, and then connecting them to other assets so that the people who are living in the low-dense areas are also then connected to the areas of opportunities for growth. So getting people to engage in this at a time when very little city services was happening, that was the critical challenge. But it happened, and the expectations of it, I think, are becoming real right now. I want to stop here for a second because I want to go back to what I said about the land use opportunities. Because the areas in green, what we're trying to do right now, and this is a key example of how to keep that engagement moving, because one of the things that we're not going to be able to do is just to work in one place in the areas that are highly vacant and only focus on growth. And let me tell you that at the mayor's office right now, we've talked a lot about the Duggan administration. The exciting thing about the Duggan administration is that they do have an aggressive growth strategy. They should. That's the mayor's job. They should do that. However, we also have to think about everybody else who's living in these dark green spaces, right? And everybody else in between. And it's up to us, the challenge that we've had, the charge that we have, is that in order for us to actually get to the 50-year strategy, the 50-year vision, we have to plan now and think differently about what this open space is going to look like in the future. And it might look very, very different. And working with the families that are living in these neighborhoods also has to be a part of the process so that they are included in what that planning looks like going forward. And so this open space network is a large part of what we're doing. The Detroit Future City Implementation Office, we just opened. We just got our 501c3, so we're feeling all sassy and whatnot. We're working in Detroit. But what that says about us also is that we are becoming a permanent institution for the future, right? Which is what needs to happen. I don't plan on being here for the next 50 years. And I certainly know Mayor Duggan isn't going to be here for the next 50 years. However, if we have an institution whose responsibility it is to carry out this vision, if we set up the foundation for it right now, and the people have the expectation that they are a part of an inclusive process of what this community should look like in the future, that's what the Detroit Implementation Office is responsible for right at this moment. And so we start with an open space network. If we can connect all of the areas in the green for strategies that will help them design neighborhoods that are environmentally sound, that have blue and green infrastructure, that have economic opportunity, and have a much broader scale and inclusivity in terms of community stakeholders, whether it's a resident or whether it's a university or whether it's some other institution that is an expert on land use, this is the network that we're creating right now. And so we have a community. We've just released our open space report. It's on our website. This is how we begin. So we work at the level that might be at this macro level, that's this large, all the way to working with vacant lots, because this is part of the vacant land use process as well. Engaging residents and neighbors working in their own community on lots, because this right here, this lot that you see, this is scattered throughout the city. You'll see these kinds of spaces. Giving communities small grants to really think about their lot differently, whether it's a stormwater or an environmental approach to a lot, or whether it's just a new community space. This is how we can keep them going, continue to keep them thinking about Detroit and what it looks like going forward. So I just want to thank you. I want you to keep up with us, see what we're doing, come visit us. There's so much more that's happening in the city. Detroit is a proud, proud people, and we're going to pick it apart and learn about everything that's happening in Detroit today. And we promise we won't tell anybody what we said when we go back to the city. We only learn but when we have to say the hard stuff. But I just want you to know that there's a group of people, that there are thousands of people who are working really, really hard today to make Detroit a very, very different place. So, thank you.
In 2009, I just quit my job as planning director of the city of Newark, New Jersey, and I quit without having a job. I was at a moment in my career, having worked probably 20 years at that point, where I was really seriously considering and feeling burnt out about whether or not I still wanted a career in urban planning. And I was becoming like a reality food show junkie, and so I was like, maybe I'll go on Chopped. And so I enrolled and I'm a creative person, and so if I'm not creating through my work, I need some other creative outlet, so food was where I had gravitated to. And so I had enrolled myself into the French Culinary Institute in New York in Soho because the full-time education was something I couldn't afford without a job. So I did this 22-week course, and I was super excited. It was every Saturday for 5 hours, and I was a complete bliss, as was my boyfriend, because I brought home the leftovers. Around the same time, this is the end of 2009, around the same time, I get this call from Rip Rapson and Laura Trudell, and they say, hey, we've been talking with the mayor, and we're trying to figure out what to do with all this vacant land. We're going to be in New York. Can we meet for dinner? I say, okay, sure, I'd love to. We meet at Bryant Park Cafe in a November night, and because so many people have been talking about Rip's diagram, this is one of Rip's mini diagram, but I dare say that this is one of the archive documents that should be retrieved and archived somewhere as part of this incredible story. So Rip is a wonderful illustrator, and all these things he has in his head, he actually produces on paper so that he can articulate them to you and bring people into the web. So, we're drinking Shiraz, we're at Bryant Park, and he's going through this 9-module diagram. And it's arts and culture, transportation, education, but in the middle, I believe, if I recall, was land use. He was like, we want you to work on this. And I said, and I'm looking at it, right, and I'm totally intrigued by the complexity of this. And I've long been a fan of Detroit. I worked there a few years ago on the repositioning of the General Motors headquarters at the Renaissance Center. And so I've always loved the city. And so I'm looking at this, and my mind is like just swirling, and the puzzle is coming together. And I say, well, your planning work shouldn't just be about land. It should be about how land is enabling all these other things to happen, and vice versa. And I just begin to talk to them about this much more integrated, complex, messy approach to tackling all these things in a comprehensive way. And as I'm talking, I'm getting just kind of excited again about planning. So thank you for that. And feeling like that perhaps this was a moment where the practice of city planning might be resuscitated, as was my love for the profession. Now, part of my disheartening around the time I left Newark was because I felt like I was doing the same plan over and over again. I didn't feel like there was a lot of inspiration or interest in innovating the ways we were rebuilding cities. And this is Robert Moses. Carol mentioned Jane Jacobs earlier. This is the nemesis of Jane Jacobs. He has become the poster child of all that is wrong and bad with planning, right? Plowing highways through communities, disrupting neighbors, building massive public housing sites and isolating families from other parts of the community. And Detroit bear witness to some of that destruction, not by Moses' hand, but by others, as did probably most of the cities that are represented here today. And so in my practice and in talking with cities, I am often having to combat civic leaders and city leaders like, we don't have time for planning, planning does bad things. And even when you talk to people in your neighborhoods, you probably get this in your cities, planning does bad things to neighborhoods. So having to overcome that, I think, was part of why I was feeling like I wanted to move away from planning. But my first full-time planning job was in Washington, D.C., under the leadership of Mayor Anthony A. Williams between 2000 and 2006. And that was a moment where I was transitioning from architecture to planning, where this phrase that a professor told me, to plan is human and to implement divine, really bore truth. Because under his leadership and through flexing the muscle of collaboration across sector, we were able to do an unprecedented amount of proactive and civically engaged planning with communities that helped to erase the memory of the legacy of the type of planning DC had seen before, like that of Moses, and actually implement the things that we were planning. So these images that you're looking at are actually plans that have moved into actual construction and implementation and transformed neighborhoods. And so the opportunity to go to Detroit was certainly with that practice in mind. So in my remaining probably 6 minutes, I'm going to try to compress just a few of the lessons we learned over 2 years into 6 lessons and innovations to take away for your discussions. The first one is this notion of collective ownership. And we've already heard during our time together this notion of leadership and flexing the muscle of collaboration. But I want to stress that there's an ownership component to that collaboration and that collective action. Civic leaders, whether it's business, government, nonprofit institution, faith-based, need to come together in collective ownership of the process, the plan that's created, and the accountability of how it gets done. And it was important for us in Detroit, where the notion of either top-down or grassroots was the only kind of narrative that we spoke about, that we also identified the community as this broader sector of community actors. So when you say community, it's not just talking about resident folk. It's talking about all of these sectors needing to come together in collective ownership. And that's the top levels of your leadership, as well as residents, business owners, and property owners. Everyone needs to feel that their fingerprints are on this, and there's something at stake for my participation. The second lesson is a transparent access to knowledge. When we started this work, there was a lot of distrust around information that was or wasn't shared and who the source of that information was. No one necessarily believed the statistic. No one believed the sky was falling around the fiscal crisis, right? So, and information sometimes is not comfortably shared, because sometimes people feel like when you have knowledge, you may use that knowledge against me. It was important that our planning process be data-driven and that that data be publicly accessible. So we created the Detroit Works Project website, where all data was available to download, discuss, debate, and share. The second lesson is jobs in the city matters. And I know there's going to be a discussion later on about the larger regional economy, and at the time that we started this work, there was a lot of work going on to try to stabilize the regional economy and put forward a proposition around growth industry sectors for the region, for Southeast Michigan. But our work took a slightly different stance, and while we knew it was going to be important to grow the population back, we were certain that growing the population back was not the absolute answer. Jobs in the city mattered, because an economy is regional, but a job to a Detroiter is local. And so it was very important, because Detroit held key economic assets that didn't exist in any other part of the region, that there really was a play to think about how to attract jobs back to the city, how to retain existing jobs in the city, and how to grow existing businesses in the city. And my colleague Teresa Lynch is going to elaborate on that point more. The fourth lesson is that every neighborhood has a future. You can imagine, and Anika alluded to this, and the date was December 9th, 2010, when the Detroit Free Press ran an editorial piece after sitting down with Mayor Bing, and the headline was, "Mayor Shrinks City to 7 or 9 Neighborhoods." That was not a good day. Because it began to erode a narrative that we were trying to put forward just 2 months earlier, that we are going to have an open planning process. And the decision had not been made, and in fact, your fear that there was a plan was not true, but now we're kind of backtracking on that. And so we had to do a tremendous amount of work to have conversations, share data, and have people think about that while your neighborhood, which 40 years ago was a very stable, single-family, traditional density neighborhood, is now 70% vacant, and oh, by the way, has been 70% vacant for maybe 20 years, is not going to be that again in the next 10 years, maybe not even in the next 20 years. But we can't stop with just sort of marking your neighborhood as high vacancy and saying that's it. And by the way, Detroit has had this legacy of planning for stabilized blight, but not planning for the ambition of what to do with that land in new and non-traditional ways. So it took us about a year to really begin to get people to think about the ways with which areas or neighborhoods could transform into something new and different and productive. People were not going to be forced out of their homes. The home ownership rate in Detroit then, as it is now, mirrors the national average. People were deeply vested in the property that they owned. It was their only equity stake in the neighborhood. So we had to find a way to build a number of strategies that enhanced qualities of life around different typologies of neighborhood conditions. The fifth lesson, again, Anika spoke to this, and I'm really proud of this because I think this is where some of our most innovative strategies occurred, was around land as a multifunctional landscape. When we first started this work, and I remember another headline where Mayor Bing was dressed up in coveralls and a farmer's hat, and the headline was talking about Detroit as the world's largest urban farm. And the notion of urban farming in a city that is 140 square miles with 20 square miles of vacancy the size of the island of Manhattan was going to use urban agriculture as a real economic silver bullet was a myth. And we needed to think much more creatively about the space in between a recreational ball field and a farm. how else could we productively and constructively use land and landscape to build community stability, raise property values? So we began this really lush set of tactics that are everything from stormwater lakes to carbon forest to about 20 different tactics for dealing with stormwater management. So the landscape became multifunctional as something you could use, but that also would be something that would help to manage water and energy. And if you're adjacent to it, because it is a beautification project, begins to help raise property values. The last lesson I'll leave you with is that the process is just as important as the outcome. As Grant Oliphant said yesterday, and in the conversations we've been having in Pittsburgh around just Pittsburgh, and the way I'm building my practice around this just city notion, is about the way in which we have to think about just outcomes distributed justly through a just process. And that headline on December 9th, 2010, which scared the crap out of people, reinforced deeply embedded fears that Detroiters had around this classic tension and a very deeply rooted tension in Detroit, which is 82% African American, that the outsiders are coming to take our city. The outsiders were white folks. The outsiders were black folks from out of town that teach at Harvard. The outsiders were people in the county. The outsiders were people in the state. And so when you have that as the context, the starting point by which you are trying to set this collective ownership, transform a conversation in a city, you really have to acknowledge that condition and build an engagement process that is really truthful to that point in time and how to touch and navigate through all of those different conditions. So your engagement has to be locally designed and executed, and we learned really important lessons from our work where we didn't get it right the first time, and we made sure we did over the next 2 years of the process. And it was around 3 important goals. So it's important that you also establish clear goals, and the goals are not just about how do we get to the plan. The goals were we had to rebuild trust and enthusiasm. The goal was that we had to blend our technical data-driven expertise with the expertise of community voice and experience. As was talked about before, the community was doing a more accurate count of vacant land than the city was able to. So they had data we didn't, and we needed to blend that with what we had. And then lastly, we needed to use the process to build a long and sustaining capacity to continue doing engagement work and to continue doing implementation. And I'll say another thing that I'm really proud of is towards the end of our work was an election. And the city had changed its city charter from being all at large to district. And so people were running in very geographic areas. And I don't remember the number, Rip, Wendy, you might remember, but I know there were a number of first-time young people under 40 that were running for city office. And many of them had been a part of our process. And actually 2 of them were urban planners, so I was even more proud of that. And while I don't think they won, I think one of them won, the fact that new leadership emerged out of what was a planning process, I think just illuminates the fact that the process becomes more than about the outcome of the plan you're trying to create. It builds the constituency for a continued collective ownership table. I am so proud to have been a part of this moment in time of Detroit's history, and I hope these lessons are helpful. Thank you.